home and I saw that it was not a pair of steelhead, but it's a male steelhead with a female coho. And because these fish were in a log jam, I couldn't really see very well when I had the camera there. So, um, and I was completely disappointed, even though it's a cool photo. I wanted a steelhead. And I think most of us, if you fish for trout and you catch a whitefish, you're disappointed, which is kind of ridiculous from, a lot of standpoints. But there's something about certain fish that we love and we want to pursue. And, there's a lot of different reasons behind that. And I think the reasons for some of us why we love steelhead more so than salmon and some of these other species that we have in the Pacific Northwest, there's some clear behavioral differences for that. And um, the main one of those for me is that, you can steelhead fish 12 months out of the year. These fish are in the rivers and they're entering our rivers almost every month of the year. And with just a little bit of traveling, if you live in Oregon or Washington, you can go target bright fish. You don't have to have a steelhead season and an off season where you have to pick up some other sport. So, as growing up, it was Chinook fishing and deer hunting. Those are kind of things that my dad got me into, and he had plenty of other things to occupy his time. But for me, it was, well, when are we going to go fishing again? You go out on opening weekend and get a deer, and you have to wait another year to go out. I wasn't really okay with that. Where steelhead, you don't have to do that, and that's not necessarily true with any of our other Pacific salmon. There's a season to them. Maybe Chinook, you get springers and fall fish, but normally they're in for a short period of time. And also when you're salmon fishing, I have a friend who had a pretty funny quote once where he said, I finally figured out how to find salmon water. Good, water for fishing for salmon is you find the slowest piece of water with 100 guys standing next to it, and that's where they're all at. And it's kind of true where they tend to school in pools. They're coming in, they have one thing on their mind, and they're in a short window. So they're all in the same places all at the same time. And steelhead are kind of the opposite of that. They have a lot of time to get to some of the places that they're going. They come in over many different months. They have a very protracted spawn timing that occurs across several months. And so, you're really spending more time searching and finding these fish. And, they really are pretty aggressive. You can catch them on a variety of different gear, whatever you enjoy fishing. A steelhead will probably eat it. Some ways are more effective than others, but, they readily eat dry flies if you're there on the right day and the right conditions. And, that's a bit different than salmon. And so there's just a lot of different behaviors of these fish that are different than other species that attract me to them. And I think a lot of other anglers have the same feelings about them. And there's a reason that I think that's important, because all those behaviors are basically born about because of the different life histories that these fish have. So life history is just all the different stages that a fish goes through in its lifetime. And that's, how many years it spends in freshwater, how many years it spends in salt. And salmon have relatively simple life histories. They only have a few different strategies. Steelhead do a huge number, nearly 40 different strategies to sort of reach adulthood and reproduction. And that is kind of what spreads them out. They're spread out in the watershed. They're spread out in time. And so we can chase these fish year round. And so, one way to look at this is if you had all of these fish sitting around at a table playing poker, if you had something like pink and chum that basically have one reproductive strategy, they come in all at the same time, they spawn in the lower part of the watershed, and their juveniles go straight out to the ocean. So, they're not spending any time in freshwater. Those fish, if they have a good hand, they're going to go all in. There's no other thing for them. So either it's kind of boom and bust. They're either going to win big or they're going to be out of the game. And so, in a good year, you can go to a chum bar and catch 50 chum in a couple hours. It's almost every cast. We're never going to really see that with steelhead. And it's because they're on the opposite end of the spectrum. And then as you kind of work through your way with salmon, sockeye have a couple different strategies. There's a few riverine sockeye. They're usually associated with lakes. Coho, a few more. They're going to be a little bit more conservative of a player. They're not going to have to go all in on every hand, but they're going to be betting pretty big. And, in good years, when they bet right, they're going to do well. In other years, not so well. Chinook are a little bit closer to steelhead. They have, 10 to 12 life histories, depending on where you're at. A little bit more conservative. And then steelhead are way out on their own, where they're not going to bet big on any hand. They're not going to be winning those big pots, but they're not necessarily going to be going broke right away. And so one way that we would describe steelhead as scientists is generalists. And the ultimate generalist on the planet is humans. We live on every continent, in every different type of habitat you can imagine. We can eat just about anything for food and survive on it. And steelhead are like that in a sense. So steelhead have the biggest range of any of our Pacific salmonids. They go all the way up into Alaska, all the way down into Mexico, down near the Yucatan Peninsula. Now, it's important to note here that I'm lumping in steelhead and resident rainbow trout. So as we get into Mexico, those are resident fish. And same thing as you get into the far north distribution in Alaska, you end up with residents at the tail end of your distributions. But these fish are the same species. When they co-occur, they are spawning together. And residency is just a different life history strategy than anatomy, than going to the ocean. And so that is how these fish are able to occupy all these different ranges of habitats, where you don't have any other species that exists this far, because they simply don't have the ability to adapt to all the different types of habitats that occur in these places. And so here I've picked 4 different rivers that kind of highlight this, where we have Tundra, Alaska, where we have resident rainbows surviving up there, and they're just outside of the range of steelhead, all the way down to interior Colombia, down into California with our shrub steppe, kind of chaparral type habitats, and then into rainforest rivers. And these habitats really are what drive life history diversity. You know, in each of these places, the fish are a little bit different. They have a different strategy to cope with that environment. And a couple examples of that, if we look at, let's start at the top here. So smolt age varies a lot as you go up and down the Pacific coast. So if we're up in British Columbia, up in the Skeena, those fish are 3.5 to 4.5 years old on average when they're going out to the ocean. It's very cold in the winter. They have a short growing season. There's a lot of food, and the salmon are spawning, but it takes them a long time to get up to this size to go to the ocean and survive as a smolt. There's kind of, you have to get a certain size before you're really going to survive very well. So there's an advantage to spend a long time in freshwater to grow big enough. As you move further south, you have a little bit warmer water, longer growing season, more food. You can see southern BC, those are mostly 3-year-old smolts. Down into Washington, mostly 2- and 3-year-old smolts. Oregon 2, and then all the way down in California, age 1 and 2. So if you think about how hard it is for a fish to grow to smolt size in 1 year, it shows you how, if you're in the right conditions, these fish can put on a lot of weight. And basically, if you're in California, you have a year-round growing season, and there's a ton of food. And then there's also a lot of threats to those fish. But if they're in the right place, they can really grow fast. And I have a friend who was from Wisconsin. We worked together for a number of years, and she's very proud of their dairy industry. And I always used to joke with her that happy cows come from California because it's warmer, there's more food, but there's some truth to it. If you're a steelhead and you're living in California, you're pretty happy if you're in the right place, because you have a ton of food, you can grow. It actually really is a good environment. I think a lot of people don't necessarily think of it that way, and it's one reason I like to use that example. But and so these are environments driving differences in fish. And a second example, this one is this was a winter steelhead I caught last year in January. This is probably my favorite fish for a couple reasons I'll get into, and at least my favorite fish of last winter. And this thing is absolutely tiny. It was maybe 18 inches. Couple reasons I don't think it was a rainbow trout, because of, you know, its body type and when and where it was. We don't really have any rainbow trout in that river that are anywhere near this big. This fish is probably 3 pounds thick, nice firm fish. And the really weird thing about it was that it was a female. And, you know, my theory behind this fish is that these fish have adapted to live in Northern California in these ephemeral streams that are absolutely tiny, where a full-size steelhead would be incredibly out of place. And one reason that I've come to that conclusion is I've seen fish, you know, 18-inch fish this size spawning in May in some of these creeks that you would never expect to see a steelhead in. And if any of you have seen John McMillan's presentation, which I'm sure a lot of you have, talks about the variation that exists with steelhead, and he really focuses on males, because males are really where the evolutionary advantage is to having all these different strategies, and females tend to do the one thing, because you just want to make as many eggs as possible. And so this is kind of a weird adaptation in California to these arid environments, where these fish can occupy habitats that maybe larger fish wouldn't. And the fish tend to be smaller there anyway, but this is on one end of an extreme. And so I'm going to revisit that later. But so as we narrow in from, you know, regionally, down into within one watershed. There's some research coming out of Alaska that the Schindler lab at UW has been working on, where within a watershed, we think of, okay, we have, say the Skagit, we have 6,000 fish come back to the Skagit. And what they're finding is that those 6,000 fish are not necessarily evenly distributed throughout the watershed, that within any given year, there are productivity hotspots. So there are portions of the watershed that are producing a lot more fish than others. And those parts of the watershed can shift from year to year. And what we're seeing, this work was done on sockeye in Alaska, which are, highly prevalent in Bristol Bay where they're at. But the same thing is likely true in steelhead. And that's in large part driven by year-to-year variation in environment. So we have warm and wet years, warm and dry years, cold and wet years, cold and dry years. And all of those differences are going to shift what the habitat is like in any given year. And you can never predict that, but that is going to make some tributaries, some sections of the main stem more productive in some years than others. And sorry. So really one way to think about this is that, every egg is like a lottery ticket. I've heard that referred to before, because the chance of any individual egg coming back as an adult is tiny. But you can think about this as individual reds as well, where each one of those reds has a fairly slim chance of coming back. But if you happen to be and put your eggs down in one of these hotspots of productivity within any given year, the odds are pretty good that your offspring are going to survive. But you can't really predict that ahead of time. And so one way that steelhead have evolved to deal with that is they go everywhere. They use every piece of habitat. And so you're going to have some offspring as a species put down in those productive areas. And so that's just giving you more lottery tickets. You're buying more tickets. So, the individual fish are not doing this, but on a population scale, it makes sense. So this kind of brings me down to what my research is focusing on is we're narrowing in on within a watershed, what is actually happening in freshwater. So why are some areas of the watershed more productive than others? And why does this shift? And what is the actual mechanism of, what's happening to those fish in the productive areas versus the non-productive areas? And currently, we have some data on what's going on in freshwater. Certainly, we know a lot about steelhead. But in most places on the West Coast, what we have is adult to adult data. So we know how many adults return, and we do spawning surveys. So we have some idea of where they spawn in the watershed. And we do that every get an idea, but there's this gap because all we really know is the adult population. And in some places we have some data on juveniles, but it's generally pretty spotty. Often it's collected at smolt traps, so it's really collected at one place, so it's not local to individual places within the watershed. So we can't really parse out what's actually going on. And also, it's much easier to study par and smolts. So fry are these little tiny guys. First year fish are known as fry or young of the year, and these are the guys that come out of the red in the spring, and they're 28, 30 millimeters when they emerge. And if you're in California, they might be 100 millimeters by the end of the summer. But these little tiny guys we see on the edge of the river when we're out fishing in late spring. Par are anything that's a year or older, and then a smolt is the stage that is actually migrating to the ocean that only lasts a few weeks in the spring. So we have a better understanding of what's happening at the par and smolt stage, but the fry stage, particularly for steelhead, is a pretty big data gap. And it is, we think, potentially a very important life stage. And so there's a fair amount of work that's been done on what happens to salmonid fry early in life. Less work done on steelhead. Most of this has been done on Atlantic salmon and brown trout over in Europe. And we're really drawing heavily on that literature to try to give us some guidance in answering these questions. So what they've really found is that salmonid juveniles undergo a critical period within the first 30 to 40 days of life. So that first month, you're losing a huge amount of your population. These fish are just simply not surviving. Once you get through that critical period, your survival rate dramatically increases. You're still losing individuals, but at a much slower rate. And so there's some research on Atlantic salmon that took this idea and said, okay, so if we're going through this critical period, what's actually happening? What's causing this? And the researchers took several sections of stream that were very similar and created artificial redds within those stream channels. So they would take a 200-meter section of stream, artificially create 10 redds evenly spaced throughout one, and cluster redds in the other one, 5 at the top and 5 at the bottom. And what they found was that in the streams with the evenly spaced redds, the fish actually grew better and they were more productive. So there was more individuals remaining at the end of that first summer. And so why would that be happening? Well, it's a bit like Black Friday, where you have a whole bunch of individuals, potentially tens of thousands of individuals coming out of clustered redds, all competing for a limited resource. And so what happens what does that look like? Well, basically these small little tiny fry, these 30-millimeter fry, they're coming out, and within the first week, it appears that they establish territories. And the way that people determine that is actually sitting there with a snorkel mask, watching these fish and counting the number of times they actually nip at each other's fins, and sort of undergo these territorial interactions. And so they're actually compete. There's a huge amount of competition that arises early on because there's so many fish in a small space, and these fish are very poor swimmers. So one theory is that, okay, well, you have a lot of fish in a small space, they're just going to move, they're going to disperse. And what they've largely found in Atlantic salmon and some of these other species is these fish don't disperse. They simply undergo a huge amount of mortality as a result of all this. And so one thing that we would like to quantify within this is how far are these fish able to distribute. So not only is this even happening, does this distribution of redds influence productivity as we've seen in Atlantic salmon, but how far can these fish move within the first few months of life, within the first summer? So we'd like to create something like this dispersal contour. You come up with density of fish in a downstream and upstream distance from the redd. Most of the distribution seems to be in the downstream direction. Most of the fish, you get pushed downstream, you're not a very good swimmer. That's likely to be what happens. And there is some evidence to say that that's what happens in steelhead, where one guy did his master's thesis down on the Rogue and some of these tributaries that dry up in the summer. And so these fish are forced to migrate every year, but these ephemeral tributaries are some of the most productive for summer steelhead. So some of these tiny little creeks that only have water in them for about 6 months out of the year were producing as many as 2,000 adults was their estimate. And so, the question is, well, what are the juveniles doing? Well, it appeared that the juveniles would emerge, they would get through this critical period, and then they would actually leave. So they're not necessarily moving as fry, they're moving once they're a few months old. And the differences that they found in that study was that these fish were such poor swimmers, they would kind of make these daily migrations up and down to search for food. And when they were little, they would often just get entrained in surface currents, get disoriented, and wash downstream. And the survival rate of those individuals is very, very low. And so it was really the fish that kind of stayed put that were, for that first period, were actually surviving the best. And so we think that's evidence that this is likely happening in steelhead. But we would like to take some of these Atlantic salmon methods and apply them to steelhead. And so this is data from the Kalawa that John McMillan collected. And the downstream side of the river is over here on the left side of the screen. And all these vertical bars that are running up the tributary length, those are the number of juvenile steelhead. Bigger bars, more fish. And so basically all this is showing is that the distribution of juvenile steelhead is not at all equal throughout the watershed. So there are places where they have a lot more fish, places where they have a lot fewer fish. And some of these big gaps either go dry in the summer or are simply above barrier, so they didn't sample them. But so you have steelhead in most of the places where, at least where you have water, but you do have variability in the number of fish there. And that's really what we want to look at. We know that fish are kind of using all these different habitat types, but if fish are not able to distribute from the redd, that would influence which parts of the watershed are most productive, which are most important for those fish, because that's where most of our fish could potentially be coming from, is not throughout evenly distributed throughout the watershed, but in local spots. So, another way just to look at this is with humans, we can, we have a lot of parental investment, as with a lot of species, a lot of mammals, and fish don't have any of that essentially. So but the way that they probably do have some parental investment is they come back and they're using the same streams and potentially the same or nearly the same spawning locations that their parents did. And so there seems to be some sort of an advantage to going back home, because your parents dropped you off in a spot that you survived, you were successful, you came back to reproduce. So there's an advantage to going back there. And so there's probably a disincentive among these fish to really move throughout the watershed. So there's some degree of distribution, but it seems that there is an advantage to staying put. And that's one of those questions that we're trying to get at. That's sort of the bigger picture question. And so I'm just going to revisit this lottery example before. And so if we think about this in terms of lottery tickets, so if we have red densities, if we increase those densities, you're essentially buying more of the same ticket. You have a set of numbers that you want to play that you feel really good about, and maybe you change a Powerball or something else where you change one number, where a red maybe has one of the same parents, or there's some reds that are laid down a couple weeks after, but in the same spot. And then if you increase red distribution throughout the watershed, you're essentially buying tickets with different numbers. You're not just playing the same numbers, you're playing different numbers. And so those are kind of two different strategies that exist. And so revisiting this example of this fish, one of the reasons I think this is so cool is, and it highlights to me that I do think distribution is really important, is that this fish is probably an example of steelhead increasing their distribution in the watershed. They're trying to take advantage of all these different places that provide different habitats that in some years are going to be really productive and produce more individuals. And so it just highlights to me that there is something to this distribution thing. And, I think if you're a steelhead, which strategy do you pick? I think most people, when they're thinking about steelhead, think of them as, okay, they're going to use all these different parts of the watershed. They're mostly tributary spawners. But I think really steelhead would pick both. They're picking both the abundance. They want as many lottery tickets in a good spot as they can, but they also want to distribute their chances of winning. So you don't pick one strategy, you pick everything. And so, I do think where people think tributary habitats are where most of these fish are going, I think we underestimate how important some of the mainstem habitats are as well. And so one of the places we're focusing in the Skagit is actually in the mainstem. And we'll probably add some tributary sites as well. There's a few details to be worked out there, but there's just so much habitat, and it's also very patchy, and it can be very far apart in a big river like the Skagit. So it's very difficult for these tiny little fry to move 2 miles downstream to a piece of optimal habitat that they don't necessarily know is there. So they're potentially not able to really move around as juveniles. And then before I wrap it up here, I just wanted to bring this out really big scale again, because I think this is something that's interesting. This is what I think about with all of this work, and why I think there's something here. And I think when most people think about evolution, we think about millions of years. Life evolves from water onto land. We get mammals. Mammals evolve back into whales. It takes this very long time, which is true. And that's the scale that we usually think of it as. And if any of you are familiar with Ray Troll, this is some of his art. He has a podcast called Paleo Nerds, which is pretty interesting. I recommend checking it out, even if you're not a paleo nerd. I'm not myself, but it's pretty interesting. And of course, he focuses on fish and aquatic organisms mostly. So, but essentially, what we're seeing with all this life history diversity and some strategies being favored in some years, some strategies being favored in others, different parts of the watershed being more productive under certain conditions. This is really the basic principle of how evolution works. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do, is go out and measure that. And there's a book called The Beak of the Finch that I've been reading lately. I highly recommend it if you have some time in quarantine here and you're looking for something to read and this type of thing interests you. But basically it just goes through and it spells this out in very clear terms, where it's just about a bunch of researchers going out and taking small measurements on a whole bunch of birds. And it sounds like it would be really boring, but if you're interested in science and evolution and kind of how all this stuff comes about, it's really fascinating, because it does highlight just that, evolution is acting on a daily, yearly type of effect. And even though it takes maybe a very long time to see dramatic change, those are very important in the short term. And so with all of that said, why should we care? Okay, this is interesting. This is how evolution works. Some parts are, more important than others in given years. But if we really want to recover steelhead and protect the ones that we have, it's really important to understand the biology of these fish, how they're using habitat, what's happening in freshwater. And if you think about any sport or almost anything we do in life, the first thing you got to do is master the fundamentals. Um, you got to get the basics down before you can go start you right at the top level. You got to work your way up. And if you don't get the fundamentals down, you might get lucky and you might get right. And you might get right quite a bit if you have most of them, but you're missing some. If you're missing some, you're just not going to be as accurate and as good if you have all of your fundamentals mastered. If you put the time, you know what's happening at every life stage in every part of the watershed, you can get the best picture possible. And it's not that we would have to go out every year and take this tremendous amount of measuring. There's a lot of ways that these types of information have already been incorporated into models in Atlantic salmon and marine fish, where they're looking at distribution of fish throughout the watershed, variations in productivity. They're incorporating those in. And so there's already somewhat of a framework out there to take some of this information and apply it. And so we think there's a lot of value in this. And so hopefully that all made sense. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
So go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a question for Nick, and you can just go for it.
I don't see a chat thing, so I don't know if any have been asked.
I'm watching the chat. I haven't seen anything yet. So
maybe I was talking too fast.
Nick, you talked about at the far ends of the distribution range, one of your photos, that you had resident trout all the way up to Alaska and as far south as Mexico. I would have thought warm water wise that would have been pretty prohibitive that close to the equator for trout. I had no idea that that any kind of trout could be seen that far down. Why does that distribution do that? And yeah, I was just kind of more curious about that.
Yeah, so some of this, those are remnants from sort of a different geologic time. If you think about when Washington was underneath glaciers, it was much cooler near the equator. And those fish are all in fairly mountainous regions where it is colder than you might expect for Mexico. Now, I've never actually been there. I've just, read about it a little bit. But those fish that are down in Mexico and even Southern California, and I've read more, and there's probably more work done. But the fish that are down there, the water is definitely a lot warmer than we have here. And if you look at the ability of those fish to persist in warm water through the summer, they are sometimes persisting in water up to 30 degrees Celsius, which I don't have my calculator on me exactly what that is right now, but very, very warm water. Water that if we had that in Washington, it suddenly appeared, it would probably kill all our fish off. But those fish have over time developed that thermal tolerance to warm water. And we see that even in interior steelhead. The John Day the lower end of the river will be 90 degrees in the middle of summer, over 90 degrees in the water. And there's no steelhead in there at the time, no juveniles, there's bass. But even though we may have portions of watersheds that get really hot for part of the year, a lot of those watersheds are still able to host trout or steelhead if there are cold water refuges, or if there are places where it's just a little bit cooler, it's just cold enough for them to survive. And not only are they're surviving in 30-degree water, but sometimes these fish are feeding and growing at temperatures that are warmer than would be lethal for, say, a coastal fish that is, adapted to BC. And so I do think that's important to kind of think about as we think about climate change. And California, those fish, there's a trade-off between productivity, where the water gets warmer and you get a lot more food and you can grow a lot faster because your metabolic rate is faster for more of the year. But also, there's costs that come with that. Are the summers going to be too hot? Are you going to lose some of that growing season? But it does show us that these fish have a pretty remarkable ability to adapt. And things will probably get most challenging with climate change at the extremes of their range further south. But if we're up in Washington, BC, and it gets a little bit warmer, well, it actually, for steelhead in general, if it's gradual enough, then it may not be that bad. if we provide them with the habitat and the, you know, life history diversity and genetic diversity to kind of adapt to that. I think I went off on a tangent, but does that answer your question?
John, you good?
Thumbs up on his screen there.
Cool. Thanks, Nick. There's a question in the chat here. Can you talk about the carrying capacity of a river or watershed? How do we make sure our rivers can support fry, par, smolts? I worry that our rivers are less fertile now, fewer salmon, less habitat, etc.
Yeah. So carrying capacity is kind of one of the big questions that we're interested in. So carrying capacity, for people who aren't familiar, is just how many individuals can a certain patch of habitat support. So that's that the entire Skagit, is that you know, Finney Creek, or, you know, the scale. But generally within steelhead, if we're talking about carrying capacity, we're looking at how many fish can we fit in a watershed on a population scale. And so one of the reasons that we think this is really valuable in places like Washington and the Columbia, where we do manage somewhat on carrying capacity, where we estimate how many fish can we fit into a watershed. We're using a number of models that are widely accepted, widely used to do that. And what's been found in the Atlantic salmon work is that those models, if they don't account for distribution, can underestimate carrying capacity. And the reason is because if you have a patchy distribution of spawning adults, there are sections of river that are essentially unoccupied. There are no reds in them. And the greater those sections are, the less your juveniles are going to be using that portion of the river. So if you increase red distribution, you would increase the amount of area that those juveniles can actually use. And because that is related to the limited dispersal ability of juveniles. So they're not able to go find all this good habitat that exists. And so basically what's been found is if you don't account for that and you do have a patchy distribution, you can be underestimating carrying capacity. And so what we want to do is find out if that same relationship appears to exist in the Pacific Northwest with steelhead. It is entirely possible that these rivers are at capacity, that we have damaged the habitat so much that it's full. But we think there's some reason to look into it further. And it depends a lot on where you're at and how many fish you have. You know, throughout the Northwest, our populations are, you know, maybe 1 to 10% of our historical estimated abundance generally. And, you know, I'm not sure that our habitat, we've lost 90 to 99% of it. In some places, yeah, I'm sure we have, but in others, you know, I don't necessarily think that's true. And I think the Olympic Peninsula is a great example of that. Certainly the Skagit has a lot more habitat degradation, particularly in the lower main stem. So, you know, I think it'll be really interesting to see what we find. And one reason I like to focus on I didn't focus as much on the Skagit is I think this does have implications for, you know, thinking about how we recover fish throughout the range, not just steelhead particularly, not just here locally in the Skagit.
Thank you.
So that makes sense.
He says thank you. Another question in the chat: is there any indication on how the evolution of spawning strategy and distribution has changed with dwindling habitat, say 1920 versus today?
Spawning, distribution, and timing?
Spawning strategy and distribution, given the dwindling habitat.
Yeah. Yes, I think is the short answer to that question. So we do have a pretty long record of spawning surveys. Now, I don't have all of that data. A lot of those surveys are more recent, so not necessarily since the 20s. It would be great if we had a map of spawning distribution from the 20s to now. We could look at this and we wouldn't even have to hardly go out and measure fish. We could probably just see the relationship. And that type of data, unfortunately, doesn't exist really in very many places. So we could probably do it on a more recent scale. One of the things that we don't have generally with spawning surveys is GPS location. So we may have a 2-mile reach of a creek that will have a certain number of reds. And so we could see a trend in the number of reds, which would give us some idea of distribution, but it's not the localized scale that we're talking about with tens of meters. It would certainly help. I think we can assume that since populations in most of these places have declined dramatically since the 20s, there has been a contraction in distribution of spawners. That's something that we do see. You have fewer fish. They're just going to use, they're still going to be somewhat clustered. They're not going to use as much of the habitat as they did when there was more of them. So I think there's some data out there that we can say that is probably the distribution is probably decreased, but that's a good question. I'll have to kind of think about that more. And then the spawning strategies, there have been some shifts in the proportion of fish that use tributaries versus the proportion of shift that use main stems in some of these places. And that's another picture that I know some people have looked at in the Skagit that I don't have a great handle on yet, and I need to get some of that data. So hopefully that's something I can look at as I continue working on my master's. And I think that more regionally, we've seen shifts in spawn timing in a lot of places, a lot of elimination of early spawners and early returning fish, Oregon coast, Washington coast. I mean, it's not just here. And that's also a strategy is the timing of when you come in. So certainly some changes there as well.
Awesome, thank you. And kind of going along with the last two questions, and you've answered this a little bit, but how do you think that this is a question for me. How do you think that this knowledge of the importance of red distribution throughout a watershed should guide recovery efforts, particularly related to habitat restoration?
Yeah.
If you were in charge, what would you do?
Well, I got to see what the results are first before we start making decisions, but we have some ideas. So there's a couple relationships that I think are pretty interesting that I'm curious to see what comes about. And I think it's also pretty place-based. So on one hand, if you increase survival at the fry stage, so that's when we're losing most of our individuals. So if you were to increase survival 1%, you would have a whole lot more par. At least, once they sort of make it through that first year, you get a whole lot more par. And so what's happening with this competition, the Black Friday example is related to density. So we call that density dependent interaction. So the higher the density, the more competition there will be between those fish. And so if you increase survival at the fry stage, you could just then increase density dependence at the par stage, and all your sort of, your sort of gains at that fry stage might be lost. And so there's trade-offs where, say you restore fry habitat, you have very poor fry survival, you have no cover for them, and they're all dying at the fry stage. So you go in, you do some restoration, you create gravel, you create complexity on the stream margins, and these fry survive super well. But then you have an overabundance of fry habitat and no par habitat. You could sort of just shift when this mortality in life is occurring. And so I think that if we know when in freshwater mortality is occurring, we can tailor restoration actions to say, okay, well, it's mostly working at fry or it's mostly occurring at par. We need to increase survival at these life stages. But also understanding what happens when you sort of tweak those is important. And so every watershed would probably be a little bit different on what the limiting factors are, and maybe even within the watershed, different areas could be somewhat different. But if we're able to kind of tease out these relationships, I think that could help direct how and where we do habitat restoration. We could actually, sort of target specific life stages. One thing is ensuring that you escape enough fish to fill up the habitat. So accurate estimates of carrying capacity. How many fish do we need to get back to sort of fully seed that habitat to fill up the watershed? That's a pretty tough question with steelhead because you have so many fish that have these unique life histories that use all different parts of the watershed, it sort of varies year to year, and it's a difficult thing to estimate. But if we can improve that, so these estimates from the current models are, there's a lot of uncertainty in them. The confidence interval is huge on, well, how many fish can we really fit? If we can narrow that confidence interval a little bit, we'll have a better idea of, well, how many do we really need to do? And we could even potentially sort of develop different management strategies within a large watershed like the Skagit. If there's 4 populations of winter steelhead in the Skagit: the Sauk, the upper Skagit, sort of the main stem and tributaries, and then the Nookachamps. And maybe these Nookachamps fish need a different management strategy than Sauk fish, because they're in completely different habitat. So I do think that this project would help get it, one, just the importance of, is that really important? Is that something we need to do? But also begin teasing out these things. And it's, within the scope of a master's, you're somewhat limited in what you can do, but there's a fair amount of research that we can bring in from other species to hopefully, draw upon and ask more questions once this is completed.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Mhm.
Another question in the chat from Dean: what are the top 3 or 4 causes of mortality in the early fry stages? Another fish using them as a food source, oxygen levels, lack of food?
It's there's predation is definitely a huge one, which is birds as well as other fish, snakes, all kinds of stuff in the rivers that want to eat them, mammals. That's a huge one. Definitely starvation is one, just not simply getting enough food. They get outcompeted. It's surprising when you're out doing surveys in the spring how many steelhead fry you will find sometimes just dead on the side of the bank. It's never a bunch, but you do see them. So what happened to those fish, it's pretty hard to know without, I don't even know exactly. You could see if they had any food in their stomach, but definitely competition, so being outcompeted, can result in not getting enough food or simply not having enough space. And you move, and one thing that one study on the Rogue showed was that these little tiny fish, if they get entrained in kind of some faster flows, they get disoriented and move downstream, which for one makes you really susceptible to a predator. If any of you have streamer fished, that imitating a wounded fish is, you have to do. And these fish that make mistakes like that, those, but also if you just get transported down, you make it back to shore, but you're in a really poor piece of habitat, you're potentially not going to get the food, you're not going to have the environment to survive. And so that's where I think that staying local is helpful. I don't think that water temperature in most places is a big cause of mortality. The one place is in like off channel areas. If you'll see a lot of pools on gravel bars or in side channels where they dry up that are just full of fry. And for the most part, those fish do die. I've seen a lot of snakes. You'll see a pool with like 6 fat snakes laying next to it and a bunch of little fish. And it's just like a buffet for them to, every time they get hungry, just to go in and eat another one. But one of the cool things that I have seen fish do is they can move through interstitial spaces. So all the little voids and gravel pretty far. We were working in the Willamette, and there's a little disconnected floodplain lake that is mostly just bass. It's super warm in the summer, but it had a little tiny hyporheic input at the top. And we found 2 juvenile Chinook in there that were maybe 30 millimeters. And the only way that they could have gotten in there, because that was never connected to the Willamette that winter, was by swimming through the gravel, through that hyporheic flow, about 300 yards underneath the full riparian forest, and then coming up in that lake. So some of those fish that do get stuck off channel, they can actually get out. Depends on, whether or not it's a bedrock pool or there's enough gravel, and whether or not they even do. I think some of that movement in gravel probably occurs before they even emerge. Well, they still have a yolk sac, but I'm not really sure. But just one more cool little story. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Any more questions for Nick? You're welcome to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. You don't have to type it in the chat if you don't want to.
So Nick, I like that you brought up the hot spots from Bristol Bay, or could also be thought of as like local boom and local bust of isolated populations. I think it's interesting that you're going to look at that in the Skagit. I'm curious your thoughts, because the Skagit is such a different system. There isn't potentially enough niche space for that kind of hotspots model to really work and maintain a sustainable fishery, because you described 4 subpopulations of steelhead, and that kind of hotspots model might just mean that there might not be 1 or 2 populations bust. They might bust big time, and we don't have as large of a system to buffer the fishery like in Bristol Bay. I mean, that's a massive system where you can have pretty substantial parts of it not producing very much. So I guess I'm curious how that's going to play out in the Skagit, which is really a different system now with all the dams.
Yeah, and it certainly is different than Bristol Bay, and that research was not on the entire Bristol Bay watershed. It was on a couple rivers, and I can't remember what they are off the top of my head. But I do think that we're likely to see the same sort of trend happening between tributaries, between portions of the watershed, where certain portions of the watershed are producing more fish in a given year than others. So in some years, fish in the Sauk are very successful. In some years, fish in Finney Creek are very successful. And so I guess as an example, I think it to me, it highlights that we can't predict what part of the watershed is going to be more productive than another. And I think the Skagit is big enough that we probably do see some variability. Now, certainly it's exposed to mostly the same weather conditions over the course of a winter. But if you're in a main stem river and you have really high water all spring, that's going to provide different conditions than if you're in a tributary where that really high water is somewhat moderated, or maybe it's exacerbated, depending on where you're at. So, I do think there is going to be some difference in productivity from different parts of the watershed. And I guess to me, it just highlights as an example, it highlights the importance of all the different life histories that exist, all the different strategies, why it's important to preserve them, because we don't know which one is going to produce most of those fish in a year. And maybe it's the same one, or the same few that are producing most of the fish in most years, but it doesn't mean that those other ones aren't necessarily important. And particularly when you do have multiple populations in a watershed, maybe those fish in Nookachams are a totally unique life history that doesn't quite fit in with the current management model. And that's just an example, not that I don't think it does or anything. I'm just sort of thinking off the top of my head here, but and also that we need to make sure that we get enough fish in all different parts of the watershed, because if we have certain parts of the watershed that go through just the right conditions, but there's only 1 or 2 reds in there, when maybe historically, maybe if we do have some evidence that the distribution of reds was much, much higher a few decades ago, there's a reason for us to look at that specific spot and say, well, what's going on here? Why have we lost so much productivity from this one part of the watershed? Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
Okay.
Cool. We've got some more questions. How you doing, Nick?
Doing good.
You need some water? Do you need to stretch? These are really good questions.
They're big questions. Yeah, I know. I should be taking notes so I can make sure to.
We're recording it. Don't worry. You can watch it later.
Okay.
Another question, is there an assumption that these boom and bust areas for fry rearing closely correspond to spawning areas? And then there's another question from a different person, but it's similar. Are red locations selected due in part because they're also good fry habitat?
Yeah, so I guess, yes, there's an assumption that boom and bust areas for fry rearing closely correspond to spawning areas. So our assumption is that fry are not moving very far from the red location. And so that period of intense mortality is going to be happening very close to the red location. Now, when we use the whole watershed example of you have one part of the watershed that's more productive than another in a given year, that's more on like sort of the reach scale where we'd say over a few miles where you have really good conditions in a certain area or not so good here. And, you know, that's something that we're not necessarily going to be able to get at with this study. We're not going to be examining huge linear distances of the Skagit River because it would be way too time intensive. And I'm mostly putting that in there as an example of why we think this is important. But what we could do is the map that, so this map, what you could do is, if we have a good estimate of how far fish can move from a red, you could put together a map like this with good spawning survey data that's going to predict what regions of that watershed, what parts of that watershed are going to have the most juveniles in them. And you could then go out and sample that throughout the season and sort of validate your model. And that type of information allows you to predict the boom and bust cycles within those areas. So, well, it would at least allow you to know what's kind of happening on the ground and what parts of the watershed are more important, whether or not some fish are, you have a lot of fish spawning in one area that aren't producing a lot of, your fry survival is very poor versus another area where you have a few fish spawning, but your fry survival is very high. And it would give you a better idea of what's going on in the watershed. It would take a long time to kind of potentially take some time to put that together, but with just spawning survey data and good understanding of what's happening of fry life history, you could learn a lot about the watershed. And I mean, I think that's probably not a very good answer to your question. And some of it is because I think that this is part of the question of what we're trying to figure out here. So I don't have an absolute answer for you because I think that's a bit of an outstanding question and one of the things we kind of want to look into. So, and then I finally found the chat, so I can answer them. Give you a break, Bridget. So, are red locations selected due in part because they are also good fry habitat? That's one I've been wondering myself. I think the mechanism here that makes the most sense to me is if fry habitat is truly very important and you have very good fry habitat, you also have reasonably good par habitat nearby that those fish can survive. It's going to produce an adult steelhead. Are those adult steelhead coming back and spawning in the same patches that their parents were? You know, what is the fidelity to red sites? There's some work that's been done on coho and other species that says that it can be very good. They can come back to the same riffle and spawn in the same spot. I do know that the red distribution in the upper Skagit, which is from the sock up to the dam, is pretty similar year to year. These fish are using the same bars year in, year out. There's, you know, variation to that, of course, but we don't have the genetic data to say that those fish were born on that bar. They were spawned on that bar. They came back 5 years later, 4 years later, and went back to the same bar. But I think that it's somewhat likely, and that's probably the mechanism of parental investment is, well, this worked once, I'm going to go back to the same place because there's a good chance it's going to work again. So yes and no, I guess.
That's fascinating to think about.
Yeah. And you know, the other thing I would say is if a tributary or it's a section of river undergoes a dramatic change, I have to assume those fish have some ability to detect good spawning conditions. And one thing that you see when you're out doing surveys a lot are test reds. And so fish will go to a patch of gravel and you'll see, you know, sometimes it's just like a little bit of scratching, like someone was in there kicking their feet. Sometimes it's half a red. It's like this kind of nondescript, sort of looks like a red, but you can't really tell, and it's pretty small. And they'll dig test reds, and you know, the theory is that they're testing, is there good, you know, subsurface flow to bring oxygen to eggs and that kind of thing. So, you know, there's a degree of sort of habitat assessment that goes into it by the fish, I think, as well. And whether or not fry habitat factors into that is a good question.
That's a very good question.
All right.
There's a
So
question in the chat, but there was one person who unmuted themselves right before that came in. So did someone want to speak up?
I'll go next.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. All right. So from David Johnson. Hi, David. What suggestions do you have for fisheries management? For example, wild spawning salmon are important for the food chain and survival of salmon and steelhead that live in the river for 2 to 3 years before migration. So, I will say that last year on the Skycomish in the North Fork in particular where I live, we had a big pink year. And this year there are a lot of resident rainbows and a lot of pretty good sized ones, much more so than I've seen in other years. And I've only been here for 4 years, but I have to assume that that is directly related to that pink run. So there's a lot of food. And so I do think that marine derived nutrients of salmon are super important for survival of fish. And if we look at California, which has 1 and 2 year old smolts, it's related to warm water, but it's also related to food. Those fish have to eat a ton of food to be able to grow to smolt size in 1 year to survive. And that's, that's an important component of habitat. And in California, since it's so productive, or even Southern Oregon, you potentially have other food sources besides salmon. As you get further north, these rivers do not have a lot of nutrients in them outside of salmon. And so it's, having good runs of salmon and escaping them to spawn and die is pretty important. And one of the interesting things, some research that just came out that I haven't admittedly finished reading, but is out of Canada. They were looking at marine derived nutrients. And one question that's been kind of weird is when we try to do nutrient enhancement by throwing salmon carcasses out in the river, it doesn't really seem to do a lot. And what they found was that you need to leave the eggs in the carcasses. So the eggs are really one of the primary food sources of, or one of the primary ways in which a lot of those marine derived nutrients go right into the fish population is at least my understanding of what the research was. But definitely the eggs were super important, was their research, which suggests that you need to get more fish out digging reds and spawning in the wild to rebuild food sources in places where we don't have what we used to. So then let me just go back and read the question again. So what suggestions do I have for fisheries management? Well, I guess the big implication that I see of potential project, should we incorporate spawning distribution into models that are used for management? So is that a relevant topic for steelhead or not? And so I guess my suggestion would be, let's figure it out. And yeah, see where it leads us. I mean, we're just kind of scratching the surface on this. I think there is some pretty cool things that can come out of it. I wish I could answer all these questions within one project, but it's just not within the scope of what's possible. But hopefully it will answer some of these questions. So then, Tom, were you the next question? Is it same? Okay. So Tom's question, does the productivity experienced during fry stage influence a steelhead's decision for anadromy? I.e., if the food is good and I'm growing fast, I'm staying, or alternatively, if the food is good and I'm growing fast, now I'm ready to go to the ocean, or is anadromy predetermined at birth? So that's a good question. So anadromy is not necessarily predetermined, but if you're a steelhead, your offspring are likely to become steelhead. If you're a rainbow trout, your offspring are likely to become rainbows. And I think there's a few reasons for that. So you hit on it. You definitely hit on it here. So if the food is good and I'm growing fast, I'm staying. So basically, if the food is really good and you're growing really fast, yeah, you're going to stay. You get to this point where why would you go to the ocean? You're going to reach size to reproduce very quickly in freshwater. And Alternatively, if you're growing really slow, the water is really cold, you may actually end up staying in freshwater because it's going to take you so long to grow to get to a size that you're going to survive at any sort of reasonable rate in the ocean. It might take you 7 years. So I think that's one reason at the very northern end of the distribution, where we have a very short growing season that's just packed with food because we have a ton of salmon coming in. Those fish stay and they're not steelhead. And when you get to the very southern end of the range, they're also staying and not going to the ocean. And obviously we have resident rainbows throughout, so it is a trade-off. But so basically it seems like it's likely related to metabolism, and there's a genetic component of that, so you can kind of inherit it from your parents. So if you're a steelhead and you have a really fast metabolism and you're growing, but you're not getting enough food in freshwater, you got to go to the ocean. And so you have these fish that have the really fast metabolisms, that's probably inherited from their parents, and one reason they do go to the ocean. And if you're a resident, you have a slower metabolism and you're able to survive in freshwater on less food, or reach that stage of maturity in a different pathway, then you're probably going to follow that pathway. And so one way to look at the trade-offs are, if you're a male, most residents, when you have a steelhead population, most residents are male. It's relatively cheap and easy to make sperm. And so those guys, they can reach sexual maturity in a year if they get a lot of food, and they'll stay. And that's what we see in a lot of these hatchery programs where we feed them really fast, or we try to grow them for 2 years, is we get a lot of residuals because those males say, hey, well, this is great. I don't have to go to the ocean. I don't have to take that risk of dying. I can reach maturity really quickly and pass on my genetic material. And for females, it's a little bit harder to reach that conclusion in freshwater. So a female rainbow trout, say it takes 2 to 3 years to mature in freshwater. Eggs are pretty costly. These fish are pretty little. They're going to maybe produce 500 eggs that are really little as a 3-year-old fish or 2-year-old fish. But they're very likely to be able to spawn multiple times. And so if they're only producing 500 eggs per spawning event, and they survive to spawn, say, 4 times, so it's maybe a 6-year-old fish or 7-year-old fish, they might produce 2,000 eggs in their lifetime. But an anadromous female might go to the ocean and come back as a 3-year-old and have 3,000 eggs, and they're bigger, so they're more likely to survive. Being bigger as a fish is almost always better as steelhead. You're more likely to survive in freshwater. You're more likely to survive as a smolt. And so an anadromous female that produces more bigger offspring is more likely to pass on her genetic material to the next generation. And so there's a trade-off where maybe if freshwater's conditions are really good, you're in the Deschutes, and you think you can survive. These fish aren't thinking. These are these are sort of physiological decision points, but it's likely that you can produce more eggs as a resident and as a anadromous female, then that decision might sway those conditions might sway your decision on whether to go to the ocean or whether not. I think that's one reason in the Deschutes why we do have a big population of resident fish as well as anadromous fish, because it's incredibly productive. So I think I got to all the parts of that.
These are really good questions. I'm impressed.
Yeah, these are great. Yeah.
Any other questions for Nick? I'm just going to keep going until Nick tells me to stop. Well, I don't think we have any more, but the questions so far have been very impressive. Again, this is being recorded, so we'll put it on our YouTube channel, and we'll send that link out. So you can watch it again. You can forward it on to anyone who missed it. Nick, you can watch it back and take notes. But Nick, thank you so much. As usual, you've been a wealth of information on a really important topic that's very, very important regionally. So we really appreciate you spending the time on this and spending the time talking to us. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you guys. I just want to say I appreciate all the questions. You guys picked up on a few things that I forgot to say when I was talking, and I really appreciate that, and I'm super impressed. They're awesome questions, and raised a few new ones that I feel like I need to incorporate. So appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. And as usual, you can send us an email, hit us up on Instagram or Facebook, and look out for the December version of our speaker series. But otherwise, have a good night.
Thanks, Nick. Night.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. All
right, we'll stop the recording.